Welcome, everyone. This is Margaret Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Trumpeter Swan Society, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, An Introduction to Wetlands, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Today's webinar is being recorded. You are muted and your video is turned off, but we definitely welcome questions, and we hope you put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. At the end of the webinar, there'll be a very short survey, and I take a look at all those. So I really appreciate if you fill those out, and you'll receive a link to the recording in 2 days after I get it put up on YouTube. So everyone who registered will get a link to the recording. Now, before we get started, I want to introduce a few people from the Trumpeter Swan Society who will be helping with this. Marianne Coughlin is one of our board members, and she will be asking the questions that you put in the Q&A. There's Marianne, thank you. Kelly Scouten is also on our board, and she's an educator at Kansas City Zoo, and she and Tiffany Mayo, who's also on our board, created two educational books we have for free for download for kids for K through 2 and 3 through 5. And there is information in there that features wetlands as well. And then Jeff Nelson is our president and of the board, and I'd like him to just talk a little bit about what the Trumpeter Swan Society does before he turns it over to our speaker, Mark Vrtiska, and panelist Mike Anderson. Go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. And thank you to everyone for attending this evening. It should be a really interesting webinar here. Just a little bit about the Trumpeter Swan Society. We were started back in 1968, and really with the restoration of swans, or the goal was the restoration of swans to their historical areas that they used to occupy across North America. They've been missing more or less in many of those areas since the early 1900s. So we do a lot of work with restoring some of the flocks that are still struggling, but we also work on management with our flyway partners and others on swan plans for those that are doing much better. We also fund research, various kinds of research, both through universities and otherwise. Part of that is a sort of a citizen science trumpeter watch, and I'm sure some of you have participated in that, where you can record swans you see while you're out and about, and we can tell you something about where they came from. Other things we work on is advocacy, which is opportunities we have to respond to needs for letters, and usually work with partners to try to deal with certain issues as they arise. We have for a long time been concerned about swan health, mostly to do with power line collisions and trying to minimize those, as well as trying to minimize lead poisoning, because lead is a big issue for swans. And one other thing we do and have done quite a bit more of recently is work on outreach projects. We have a film project that is now showing on public television. We have newsletters and that sort of thing. And then finally, we have educational opportunities we try to put on. And that's what this is tonight, as a webinar where we try to bring information of interest to our members and others who want to know more about swans and their habitat. And we hope that these kinds of presentations not only fill in information needs for you, but also create even more interest in yourself and others who are cheering on the swans as they continue to recover. So thanks again for attending, and look forward to the webinar.
Go ahead.
Do you want me to?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad you're with us tonight. I'm Mark Vrtiska. I'm a professor here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the School of Natural Resources. And we're going to take a little bit of tour here kind of on some wetland information. And in fact, we'll kind of go through several things here. We can't get too far in depth here in some of these topics. We could probably have independent webinars in some of these, and maybe some of these we probably should. But again, we're going to kind of go through some of the real basics here and kind of wrap it up with how you can help. Again, we're going to start out kind of with the title. What we're going to be talking about again is we'll start off with the good part here and talk about wetlands themselves. And again, you're looking at this nice wetland here. nice wetland vegetation, a bunch of ducks on it, an egret there in the background. Again, kind of a nice setting in terms of a wetland. Wetlands can vary. You can kind of have these lakes, and this is from the Nebraska Sandhills, a nice shot here. But again, when you start going around the country to different parts of the US and Canada, you're going to see different wetland types. One that's my favorite that we don't have here, and I got to travel a little bit to get to them, are cypress tupelo swamps. They're a neat ecosystem. Coastal marshes are another one that, again, in terms of some of those of you that may be living on the coast are familiar with vast expanses of marsh that have a lot of diversity of wetlands and or of plants and wildlife. Some really cool ecosystems there. Some of you probably are a little bit more accustomed to kind of wetlands in a forested kind of region or kind of territory. And again, these kind of range from these nice lakes to maybe a little bit more boggy habitat. And then even you may not think of them as a wetland, but large lakes and so forth are a type of wetland. There's a classification scheme that does include large lakes and so forth. So wetlands are a diverse type of habitat. So it's when you say wetland, there's a lot of different meanings behind that. And the other thing too here that I want to hit on again is, and the trumpeter swan actually is a good example of this in terms of a bird that probably uses all these habitats, maybe not the cypress tupelo swamp so much, but definitely all these other wetland types, from the relatively shallow ones to the deep lakes and so forth, forested areas. Trumpeter swans through the different parts of the year in different parts of the US and Canada use these different wetland types. And that's common through a lot of other waterfowl species or water bird species, that a diversity of wetlands is important to a lot of wildlife, in particular wetland birds. So if you were taking my waterfowl class this fall or this spring, you'd have to know this definition kind of a lot more in depth. And there's not going to be a quiz or anything here after this, but this actually kind of is more or less the big definition of a wetland. And again, I'm going to kind of break that down a little bit. So it's like, okay, what is a wetland? Well, when you're talking about a wetland, there's three things that you really need to remember that kind of defines a wetland. Obviously, when you think of wetland, you think of a place that gets inundated or has water on it, and they do have to be inundated at some point in time. That doesn't mean necessarily, and we'll talk about this, that they need to be wet all the time. But again, there's got to be some inundation at some point in time, whether it's on an annual basis or even over a couple of years. The thing that really kind of helps define a wetland, honestly, is the soil. The soil has to be of a characteristic that is actually ponding water or allows the ponding of that water. And not all soils do that. Obviously, when you get a bigger rain event or something to that effect, a lot of places can hold water, but that doesn't necessarily mean that soil is characteristic of wetland soil. With the inundation and the soil, what that arises to is the vegetation within that area, or the potential vegetation that can occur there. So when you have, again, inundation and the right soil type, that vegetation is going to have to be accustomed to or have evolved with inundated soil types. So it's going to be used to water at certain points in time. If it doesn't have water at certain points in time, doesn't have the right soil, it's not going to be a wetland. So those are the three important characteristics, that obviously you have water, but you also have to have that soil and the vegetation. And as I alluded to, wetlands, one of the things that fools people a little bit is that they anticipate or think wetlands always have water. And probably for the vast majority of wetlands, they do. But when you kind of get into some areas similar to here that we have in Prairie, Canada, the central part of the US, they're not. And actually most of the time probably they're dry or you don't see water at all or very little. And I really like this graphic because this kind of represents kind of the prairie potholes that we see in the north central US, prairie Canada, and some of the playa basins, and I'll talk about that a little bit here in Nebraska and in the western part of the US. Again, they can dry up within a year. They can be wet for a number of years and then dry for a number of years. But again, the key characteristic here is they do get wet. And with this, they have the soil and vegetation when they're wet that makes them a wetland. And again, to identify wetland vegetation, you have to have a little expertise about looking at the various plants and saying, yep, that's a wetland plant. And again, some of the vegetation here, and I'm not going to go through or identify any of that, but when I'm looking at this slide, I'm looking at, yeah, there's some vegetation there that you're going to see this stuff only in a wetland. You're not probably going to see some of this vegetation in your lawn or anywhere else, or up in the uplands or the grasslands. It's going to be contained kind of within that wetland area. The other one that really does take actually a lot of expertise is looking at the soil and kind of determining if it's a wetland soil or not. And that's a special expertise that's required to kind of really define these wetlands if you're getting to that point. And it's not something you can just pick up and go, oh yeah, it looks like, wetland soil, or oh, it's mud, it should be a wetland. There's characteristics about wetland soils that exist. And again, a certain amount of expertise is needed for that. So when we're talking about wetlands, there are a lot of benefits that we know that wetlands provide. And we know this, there's been numerous studies. In fact, there's a lot of information out there. It kind of surprises me how much information we have in terms of actually pointing out all these benefits that you see here. So it's not necessarily one of those things that we think, or we kind of suspect. We actually have data and information on, and again, through a wide variety of wetland types and across not only here in the US and Canada, but across the world. And so we'll go through these real quick and kind of talk about them. And one of the more important ones, I believe, is the improvement of water quality that wetlands provide or can provide. So this is a wetland in Iowa. And if you look kind of at the bottom right of the screen, you can kind of see this stream coming in here. So this is after a big rain event, and you notice the water here coming in is pretty murky, this kind of chocolate milk color coming in. And as it kind of goes through, it's kind of a unique system here. I'm not sure what's exactly going on, but all of a sudden, all that water starts clearing up. And so what wetlands do is kind of act as this filtration system where the particulates can drop out or used up by the vegetation and so forth. And the water quality that you see coming in and where it's going to go out here in the upper left is vastly improved. And using that kind of quality about wetlands, we've started recognizing that we can actually use that kind of the wetlands as an ecosystem to kind of help us in terms of our own water systems. So instead of having water treatment plants in cities and municipalities kind of on these artificial systems and so forth, we can actually build wetlands and do the same thing and do it a lot more efficiently, as well as maybe even actually end up providing a lot more of these other benefits. So again, water quality is a big one in terms of benefits provided by wetlands. Another one that I believe is really important is flooding and then soil erosion, or kind of preventing that. But it's while it's definitely a benefit and a big one, it's just kind of really hard to quantify to a large extent. And when you look at a landscape in the upper left that has intact wetlands and all that, what you're going to see in a big rain event is those wetlands capturing a lot of that water and at least slowing it down. When you drain or destroy those wetlands or fill those wetlands, all that water goes into that the stream or the drainage really quickly. And wetlands don't prevent flooding per se. They really alleviate the severity and probably the duration of flooding. And when you remove them, you start seeing the real severe floods, the rapid rise, and again, a lot more destruction going on. And the reason why this is difficult for people to comprehend is because, um, once you start taking away wetlands, you get the flooding, but you don't necessarily associate it with the wetlands. This is not one of those things that is unfortunately as researchers and conservationists would like to prove. It's kind of hard to do a controlled experiment on this, but this benefit is definitely there, and we've seen some places kind of look at this and recognize that wetlands would have really helped us in this case. Another one that's important, at least, and again, when I'm looking at my state, this is a big one in terms of groundwater recharge. So again, I had mentioned earlier about playas, and what playas are relatively shallow wetlands, kind of circular in nation, and I'll show you here a picture after this, but kind of out here, and probably other wetlands too, that get a little dry, but out here, these playas, what happens is eventually they go dry, and as they dry up and remain dry, what happens is the clay pan that actually can hold water will start contracting. And what you have is these big cracks in the ground, which can get pretty large, that open up, and so they're there. And what happens, we have a big rain event and this runoff starts going into the playa. All that water runs into the playa, but the first place it runs into is all those cracks in the ground and starts sinking in and immediately going into the aquifer at a quote relatively higher rate. So all of a sudden now you kind of have this direct linkage, if you will, almost between rain precipitation and going into the aquifer. And again, when you go through the playas like this, remember this is water quality also working here, that you get the benefit of water quality going down into that aquifer as well. Eventually, even as that clay gets moist, it'll expand and kind of seal those cracks, but that water will still kind of recharge at a lot slower rate, but still go down into the aquifer. So again, highly important here. This is what I'm talking about in terms of playas. These are some playa wetlands in western Nebraska, out in a crop field. But this is kind of what you're looking at with these, no more than 2 or 3 feet deep, kind of roundish in shape for the most part. And again, you get some rainfall events or a lot of snow in the wintertime. They start melting. You have a lot of water on the landscape and a lot of habitat for birds to use. And I've seen trumpeter swans on these things multiple times here in Nebraska using these type of habitats. And again, for Nebraska and other states here in the plains, Nebraska is the home or the inventor of center pivot irrigation, and we have a lot of irrigation here in the state. Groundwater recharge helps that, and actually probably makes our economy go, at least in our state and probably a lot of others here in the plains. But for everybody listening in here, again, all wetlands probably provide some sort of groundwater recharge. And again, if they don't, they're cleaning your water for you to drink. So again, wetlands, in terms of you just being able to turn on a tap and get some good clean water, think of wetland. Wetlands do produce food and fiber. So when you're at Thanksgiving dinner this November and you like cranberries, like I do, think of wetland, because that's where they're going to be grown at and where you're going to get them from. But just again, in terms of some of the things in other parts of the world, wetlands, again, they're wet, they're productive. You can have, in terms of kind of crops like hay, cattle grazing, and so forth, go through those wetlands. That again kind of produces food and fiber for us. A big one that, again, has been quantified, and again, a big one in terms of a benefit is carbon sequestration. And we probably haven't acknowledged this one as long as we have some of these others, but it's definitely a huge benefit. And again, when you're looking at some of these massive coastal wetlands and expanses of coastal wetlands, all the vegetation and everything that's going into those, it's a big component of carbon sequestration. And we'll talk a little bit more about the reason for that, or the benefit behind that. So there are states out there now that have plans in place that are looking at how to kind of capture carbon on the landscape, so we can reduce that. I got this from the plan in North Dakota. And so when we look at kind of the wetlands in North Dakota, the prairie potholes and so forth, if we could look at not converting wetlands and kind of right beside those wetlands are all the grass, if we can avoid conversion by both wetlands and grasslands, the amount of carbon that's captured is tremendous. We add on wetland restoration and grassland restoration, we're talking about a lot of carbon being synced. That's going to help us down the road with some other things, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But again, carbon is captured by wetlands in a big way. As well recognized, and again, trumpeter swans, they need wetlands undoubtedly. But there's also a lot of other wildlife, and definitely any fish that live in these wetlands, and plants that depend on wetlands. And again, wetlands are one of the more productive natural systems, not only again in here in the US or Canada, but across the world. When you look at some of that, they exceed that. There's probably only a few ecosystems that beat that, like rainforests and so forth, but wetlands are really productive. This is a graphic basically in terms of habitat here again, and I'm using the state of Nebraska as an example. But when we look at habitat kind of by species group, is that here in Nebraska, 50% of the plants are kind of wetland dependent, or use wetlands, or can use that habitat. As you might suspect, 100% of all the amphibians need some sort of wetland habitat. 30, almost 40% of the reptiles, 50% of the birds, which is kind of eye-opening in a lot of ways, that half the birds in this state need wetlands. And then actually probably another thing, just in terms of, you would not necessarily think that almost 40% of the mammals also depend on wetlands. So again, in terms of providing habitat for fish, wildlife, and plants, wetlands are critically important. But that even takes a step up when you're starting to talk about threatened or endangered species, and the vast majority of threatened or endangered species are dependent on or use wetlands. So the whooping crane is dependent on wetlands from the time it's nesting up in Canada, as it migrates south, winters in Texas, and right now there's whooping cranes in the state of Nebraska headed back north right now. They're all using wetlands of some sort. The bird on the right is a piping plover, which again is threatened, federally threatened here in the U.S. Again, needs wetlands. So wetlands are critically important for threatened and endangered species and a lot of other species as well. And finally, again, I think a lot of us recognize that wetlands provide some recreation and educational benefits. One of the biggest ones, I think, just in terms of kind of conservation of wetlands, is that tradition of waterfowl hunting. People are required to purchase stamps and so forth, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But a lot of other things in terms of conservation that come out. Again, that's directly related to wetlands and wetland conservation for the benefit of waterfowl, but that translates into a lot of other species. But again, with the diversity of wildlife in wetlands and the diversity of birds, again, wetlands are a popular place for people to go view wildlife and bird watch. So again, a lot of benefits provided by that. Okay, so we went through the good. We kind of talked about those. We're gonna go down a different path now. And we're gonna go back in the way back machine here a little bit and back to when we started becoming a nation here in the US. And back in those days, revolutionary period, we were looking at almost 400 million acres of wetlands in the US. About half of those wetlands were actually in the states of the conterminous US. Surprisingly, if you didn't know it, when we added Alaska, we doubled our wetland acres almost. But a lot of wetland acres in Alaska, and even surprisingly for Hawaii, 59,000 acres in a kind of an island habitat. That's a lot of acres of wetlands. So that's again when our founding fathers were here and putting the nation together. This is what they were seeing on the landscape. And of course, things happened, and when we look at the next 200 years, so let's go up to about 1980, 1990 or so forth. In those 200 years since we became a nation here in the U.S., we've lost almost half of our wetlands here in the conterminous U.S. And when you kind of stop and think about it, what's happened since that time is that we've lost 60 acres of wetland each hour. So when you kind of put it in that perspective, it gets a little bit staggering to think that we've lost that many wetlands. And when you kind of start looking at some of the states and kind of separating those out a little bit, again, Florida's lost the most. California has lost the largest percentage at 91%. And surprisingly, California had a pretty good chunk of wetlands and a pretty important chunk of wetlands out there. 22 states lost more than 50%. 7 have lost more than 80. So already half the states have lost 50% or more of their wetlands. And only those Alaska, Hawaii, New Hampshire have kind of kept more or kept the majority of their wetlands. So we've seen some stark reductions in wetlands. And again, you could really dig into this and start looking at some of this stuff. And again, and this is one example, again, coming back to my state here in Nebraska. If you were to travel here to the state, what you're looking at here is right below I-80, below the Platte River. So if you would come right now, you would see cranes probably from about sandhill cranes from about right here all the way to Grand Island. Again, they're peaking at numbers right now. So just south of the Platte River is this rainwater basin area with a lot of shallow wetlands historically. Again, not very deep at all. And even the semi-permanents or the ones that are deeper, maybe at tops 8-10 foot deep, and rarely you're going that deep. And again, when the European settlers were coming out to Nebraska, what they were looking at were 210,000 acres of wetlands out there on the landscape. And again, wetlands comprise at least 5% of that landscape. Again, a lot of small temporary wetlands. And when I say temporary, I mean they're not flooded for very long during the growing season, but you had to let them on the landscape. Okay. What you're seeing now in this part of Nebraska is that we've lost almost 80% of those wetlands on the landscape, and wetlands now comprise only 1% of that landscape. And if you take a look here, you can kind of see the blue dots up top versus down the bottom, and you're seeing a lot of the remaining wetlands are those large permanent wetlands, which are the larger ones, deeper ones. We've lost a lot of those shallow, kind of ephemeral wetlands that again provide important habitat for a small period of time, but they're tremendous benefits for shorebirds, water birds, ducks, geese. So we've lost a lot. And why I throw this up is because if you look at the overall statistics for the state of Nebraska, we have a big chunk in our state, the north central part, the Sandhills region. Well, the sandhills have not been converted too much. There's still a big ranching community, which needs grass, needs the water to water their cattle. And when you look at the state as a total, we've lost less than 50%. But when we get down and look at some other parts of the state, we've lost 80, 90% of the wetlands there. So again, just looking at those percentages doesn't necessarily tell you the whole story. Okay, going on with more bad. And again, here, some of these threats that are happening to wetlands, and I should, maybe threats is not the appropriate word because this is what's going on. So it's an actual wetland occurrence, but one of the big ones with wetlands is draining and filling those wetlands. These are a couple shots from Prairie, Canada. And as you can kind of see here really easily that on the left here, you can see the drain just dug basically a ditch to another low spot where the water will go on out. On the right, what you see is kind of this wetland here in the upper right. It gets drained out, but you're seeing kind of a couple other wetlands being drained into this single ditch, and it's going on out. So they kind of connect the drain tiles or the drainage ditches, and it all goes out through one place. Again, these are pretty easy to put in, and it doesn't take a whole lot of equipment for very long to do that. The only silver lining on that is that if you wanted to restore this wetland, basically all you had to do was put a plug in here on this ditch and this wetland would start functioning again right away. And same over here, put a nice plug in here and these wetlands will start functioning to a large amount. The only thing I do see disturbing here is on the photo on the left, I see this looks like land leveling equipment, which that's, you don't want to see that too much, but again, you got that. Here in the US, in the Dakotas and kind of other places here in the Midwest, we're seeing a lot of this, which is kind of this pattern tile drainage. And again, this is working where water hits the landscape, basically hits the tiles, and this is probably all draining into a ditch or a canal of some sort, of a shallow one, and it goes off. So basically, the wetlands you see kind of here in some of these photos, they may get a little water in them, but they won't get water in for very long. So the duration is really reduced. And I'll remember this because we'll kind of sweep back to this, how some of this is working. But this is really, really hammered some wetlands in North and South Dakota, Iowa, Minnesota, and even here in my state, Nebraska. You do see, I don't think you see a lot of filling anymore of wetlands, not directly, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, how it's kind of happening indirectly. But you don't see a lot of this where people are just throwing dirt into a wetland. But again, the drain tile, it kind of comes in a couple of different ways. Again, you have these massive machines this is digging pretty deep to lay that tile. This one again is just a simple drainage ditch. Again, if you wanted to restore the wetland, which it's hard to see, but it's back here, you put a plug in anywhere along this ditch and this wetland will start functioning again. But again, this wetland back in here is going to drain out pretty quickly. And so what I meant by filling wetlands, what I'm talking about here is sedimentation. So all these, again, you've seen a lot of these pictures that crop fields surround them. What you have in a big rain event is a lot of sedimentation, topsoil going into those wetlands. And again, in a lot of places in the central US and in Canada, they're farming right up to the wetland edge. Again, here, they're planting corn right as far as they can get without getting stuck. And again, what you have is a lot of topsoil going into these wetlands. And when you get this much topsoil in here, what happens with this is that it really changes the hydrology of these wetlands into function. So you don't get the flooding duration as much. It changes the vegetation. It affects it in a big way. Another big one that's occurring across North America and probably elsewhere is invasive species. This is an example along the Platte River, kind of a back channel, side channel. here in our state, but I've seen it elsewhere in some coastal habitats. Phragmites, man, that's a bad one. It will just simply take over a marsh or a wetland area, and it's really tough to control. And that goes for a lot of those invasive species. Purple loosestrife, I know, is a bad one, kind of the north central part of the U.S., Michigan, Minnesota, that kind of area, and maybe elsewhere. Reed canary grass and hybrid cattails, a problem here and elsewhere. And again, something maybe as simple as trees, which you wouldn't think is necessarily being invasive, but to wetland they can be. Again, trees in a wetland will start changing the hydrology of that wetland. Another one that you may not think about, but it definitely impacts wetlands here. And again, it's this lack of natural processes. So if we look at some of these playa wetlands that I've been showing you here in the state of Nebraska and elsewhere and across, the Central Plains, these wetlands, quote, evolve with these natural processes. So that, they quote evolved or had to deal with 50, 60 million buffalo running around and a whole bunch of buffalo coming in there and wallowing around in there and using it and grazing and so forth, using their hooves to stomp the bottom. That's part of the natural process. Fire was a big one here in the plains. But if you stop and think about other processes in other parts of the world, another good example, I believe, is this is a levee system that you can see kind of goes off into the distance here. This is on the Red River in Louisiana, which is a tributary to the Mississippi. And what you're seeing here is bottomland hardwood forest. And bottomland hardwood forest, again, is a wetland type that it's really evolved with flooding and inundation. So when you look at kind of what's going on inside this levee, this area is probably getting a little bit too much flooding. This area on the other side of the levee is probably not getting enough. And again, it's that natural process of flooding, duration, and so forth that makes that bottomland hardwood system ecosystem go. I've alluded to it a little bit. And again, coming back to that carbon sequestration and how important that is because again, one of the things that we're starting to see with wetlands is an impact from climate change. And this is a big one. And again, we're probably starting to understand this in the last 20 years a lot more. And again, we're already starting to see some changes on the landscape. And I think, it's hard to kind of wrap your head around this, but what we're going to start seeing with climate change, and we have already seen, actually, we've already seen it, is in terms of kind of changes in severity of storms, precipitation amounts, where they're occurring, all that sort of thing. And one of the bigger ones that we're seeing right now, and this is due to climate change, is like when you're going to these coastal habitats and sea level rise. We're already seeing this. And I just use Louisiana as an example. But again, you can kind of see how much habitat's been lost in Louisiana. And again, kind of this rate on an annual basis that we're seeing. And again, this is directly due to climate change. But we're also going to see some changes potentially, and then maybe a little bit more subtle. But again, how often these wetlands get wet, or maybe how long they stay wet, when they get wet, whole lot of other things that are changing just due to climate. All right, kind of taking another step. So we recognize, we know wetlands have benefits. We know that wetlands, as again, you start thinking about their benefits and really, if you stop and think about wetlands being kind of like the kidneys of the natural world or the kidneys of the natural ecosystems that we have, they're important. That's what they kind of do. That's kind of how they function. And we probably all aware that in terms of a medical condition, if your kidneys fail, you're in a bad way. Well, we're kind of in a bad way because we've lost a lot of wetlands. But the other problem is that we're maybe in a hospital here that doesn't have anything to do with helping our kidneys here. And what I mean by that is talking about wetland protection. And so here in the US, when we talk about wetland protection, we know these wetlands are good, benefits come from them, but we don't protect them very well. Again, here in the US, it kind of falls under federal authority. And for a long time, since about 1972, when the Clean Water Act was enacted, there was provision within that, Section 404, that kind of did protect wetlands to a large extent, was fairly effective in doing that, and did it for a number of years. Well, that changed, and again, my personal belief, this is a pivotal decision in wetlands, was the 2001 Swink decision. And again, we could actually have another webinar on all this, but that was a big one, kind of followed up by another Supreme Court decision in 2006. And again, a lot of confrontation, arguments, and so forth about protecting wetlands on these, and what was the ability of the Corps of Engineers of 404 to do that. WOTUS, what you're talking about, there's waters of the U.S. And soon after kind of the 2006, relatively speaking, 5 years, we're into the waters of the U.S. And all that. And again, that takes a whole webinar to go through all that. It started out relatively positive in 2011. It's kind of been batted back and forth since then with changes in administration. And then again, just a couple weeks ago, there was a new memo coming out from the Corps of Engineers and the EPA, which kind of mandate the 404 permits and Clean Water Act. I have not had time to digest this memo, but I would put a lot of money on, if I was in Vegas, that this is not going to help in any way, shape, form, or fashion wetland protection in the U.S. The only thing that we do have right now is the swamp buster provision in the Farm Bill, which again kind of really stops ag producers from converting wetlands, because if they do convert one, they're going to lose some federal farm program benefits, and that's not a good thing. And so we've had that. The only thing, again, there always something coming up, and I just found out here not long ago that there's a lawsuit about the swamp buster provision and potentially it being unconstitutional. The other thing I'll mention, when we think back to the drain tile, that pattern drain tile that I was talking about earlier, that's one way ag producers have gotten around, I think, swamp buster, is that they put the drain tile out there, which does not allow the water to get to those wetlands, but they don't convert the wetlands. They're still a wetland, given again with the definition, but now those ag producers can go around those wetlands. I'm going to kind of turn it over to Mike Anderson here, that knows a little bit more about Canada, because it is a little bit different in Canada in terms of wetland protection. So, Mike, if you're able to do that.
Yep, I can go, Mark. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Anderson. I'm an emeritus scientist with the Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research of Ducks Unlimited Canada, based in Winnipeg. Yeah, the situation in Canada is quite different. The federal government only has jurisdiction over wetlands on national wildlife areas and in Department of National Defense lands, which aren't all that extensive. Nearly all of it is under the authority of provincial and territorial governments. So it's a complex business. Instead of having to work, at a national level in the US to try to do something useful for wetland policy, here there's 13 jurisdictions that conservationists have to work with to try to do something positive. The status of wetland policy protection is highly variable across the country. There are several provinces that have reasonable policies in place. The maritime provinces in the east have some of the better ones. Some jurisdictions don't have any wetland policy. Some are very new, like Saskatchewan has just come out with something within the last month. But the challenge here is that while some places like Alberta and Manitoba that have a lot of wetlands have a reasonably good policy on paper, the actual implementation of the policy is where the weak link lies. If we're talking about a major development by an industry or by the government, like say a new highway, those people have to do a pretty good job of abiding by the current policy, which limits their ability to drain or requires them to mitigate by restoring wetlands to replace ones they do drain. But the vast majority of the challenges we face are on farmland. And there, the local enforcement is really very weak. It tends to be farmer on farmer, a neighbor in the position of having to sort of squeal on their neighbor. And so a lot of what happens out there is just, people just look the other way. So we have we made progress looking back over the last 10 to 15 years. Many of these policies now exist, which they didn't before, so there's something to work with. The problem is that there just isn't the level of institutional protection in place that really works well. So there's still much to do here, but making slow progress. Okay, Mark.
Thanks, Mike. There's hope, though, I think, folks, to some extent. But again, I think some of the benefits are starting to pop up in some regions. Again, I'm going to kind of center here in the center U.S. and the plains. And what you're looking at there is a map. If you see the gray area, that's the Ogallala Aquifer. And that's pretty important to this part of the world. Again, if you look at this and just in terms of irrigation for the nation, 30% of the irrigation comes out of this. So it's an important region for that. But you're looking at this map going, what is this? Well, if you look at the bright colors, the reds, the yellows, kind of the purples, that's where the aquifer has been depleted due to mostly agriculture. But it's also due to maybe some city use, towns, industry, and so forth. And with that, we've seen impacts on fish and wildlife. But this aquifer is being recognized as being depleted, again, due to water usage and not very good water usage or efficient. And actually, when you talk about hope, here's a city in the state of New Mexico, kind of near the Texas border. The city of Clovis recognized, and they were having problems obtaining water for their city. They worked with some conservation organizations in the Ply Lakes Joint Venture, which is a partnership of a bunch of conservation organizations, and met with them and talked to them. Hey, these playas recharge your aquifer. You need to have these. So here we have a city that's kind of starting to do things and partnering up in terms of wetland habitat conservation, which again, 20 years ago just would not have happened. So again, I think some people are seeing that in terms of, and there's other benefits like flooding reduction and alleviation that are coming about that people are kind of acting on. To wrap this up, what I want to tell you is what can I do? What you hopefully we've impressed upon you that, man, there's a lot of not good things going on with wetlands. What you can do right now is go online, go to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and you can buy a migratory bird hunting and conservation stamp. You can buy one in Canada. It's a migratory habitat stamp, I believe. $8.50 there, but $25 here in the U.S. You purchase this stamp. The funds from this go directly into into wetland conservation directly, and about 90% of that funding goes in there. Easy to do. You can do it on an annual basis, or you can buy as many stamps as you want. But this is the quickest and best way immediately in terms of help of getting more wetlands and protected and conserved. The big thing again is we've kind of just got done talking about. The big thing is keeping yourself educated, keeping others educated about wetlands, anything you've heard on this webinar that will help. But advocacy for wetland and wetland conservation protection is needed, and it's definitely needed at the ballot box. Again, I don't want to say too much, but we're seeing changes right now and going to see probably even more changes in wetland protection due to this very thing and what we're seeing in changes in terms of who's making the decision. So this is a big one. With that, I'd like to wrap it up. Again, I appreciate your attention. And if you have any questions, Mike and I would be more than happy to talk about them. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate that. I learned a whole lot, so thank you so much, both of you guys, for doing that. Marianne, are there any questions that have come in?
Yes, there are, Margaret. Thank you. We've got several questions. The first one is whether it comes in, have you been to the farthest north Cypress Tupelo wetland in Illinois, Cache River wetland? And there's a question of whether there might be trumpeters there.
I have not been there. And I can't speak for Mike or anybody else, but I have not been there. But that is one of those places that actually kind of is in my bucket list. If I can never get near there, I want to go there. I doubt, again, trumpeter swans are not something that use forested or Cypress Tupelo forested wetlands very often. So I don't know if you'd see any trumpeters there. So that's not a place I would go to go see a trumpeter, but I definitely want to go see there. Again, that habitat is unique, and if you've never been in a Cypress Tupelo swamp, put it on your bucket list. They're cool.
We have another question coming in. This one's from Canada. And this person has land abutting a wetland in Muskoka, Georgian Bay area of Canada, and is experiencing beavers chewing down all of their trees. They have a huge beaver dam, and they're wondering if there's any advice, since beavers are wildlife and there is part of many wetland ecosystems. If you have any advice on how to manage the beavers and your property near beavers.
Oof, boy, that can be a really long answer. There are alternatives. And again, yeah, beavers can kind of cause a problem with that. They are kind of part of that natural ecosystem, but again, there's probably a limit about how many you want and where they're doing all their sorts of things are. It'd be kind of really difficult to kind of go through that here without making a real lengthy one. If that person can provide their email or something, I might be able to get them information on how to deal with beavers.
Yeah, I'll just add that it kind of depends on the setting. In some cases, beaver dams can add useful habitat for other critters by damming up a small stream or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I've personally experienced wetlands that have been, a nice aspen bush on a hillside over a wetland has been completely destroyed. And beavers built a lodge and were there for several years, but they do eventually eat themselves out of house and home and usually move on, and those systems sort of, come back. But you have to have a long-term view of things and to tolerate those kinds of changes. If you don't want them tearing down your forest, that's a different matter, and maybe Mark can provide some resources that can lead you to ways that you might be able to legally do that. But they're a mixed blessing for sure.
Thank you both. There is another question, which is, are the irrigation systems depleting the aquifers in Nebraska and causing salination of the soil?
They're definitely being depleted in the southwestern part of the state. That aquifer is not so much in kind of the northern part of that, but there's not as much center pivot irrigation there. Actually, no, it's not necessarily affecting that water's high quality. It's not affecting, as far as I know or have heard, any kind of changes in the soil or the pH or anything like that. But we're seeing depletions here in parts of the state.
The next question is whether or not have we stopped or reversed the trend of wetland loss in North America? What does the future look like?
We have not stopped it. We have not stopped it, and we definitely have not reversed it. And again, the future, in the immediate future, honestly, I don't like to be a Debbie Downer or anything here like that, but it's honestly right now not looking good. Again, just kind of given the current people that are making decisions and wanting to make decisions, it's probably not going to be good here for the next few years. And we'll see what happens after that. And you never know what happens down the road that will kind of change things, but we're in a bad way with wetlands, to be quite honest with you.
Yeah, I'll add for Canada. It's much the same story. There are joint ventures that have come together under the North American Waterfowl Management Plan that can show that we have reduced the rate of loss in many areas where things would be much worse if it hadn't been for the work that conservation agencies are doing to help ameliorate some of that loss. But the overall trend is still downwards. And I just want to add that policy with respect to wetland protection or wetland drainage is really critical to do things at a very large scale. The U.S. also has an opportunity because the Farm Bill in the U.S., the federal Farm Bill, has a lot of money, and they really do affect what happens on the land through programs like Swamp Buster and Conservation Reserve programs and so on. Unfortunately, we don't have those same programs in Canada. But there are instruments of incentives, voluntary incentives for landowners, or policy prohibitions on drainage that have come and gone over the years. And if you look back over the last 40 years, you'll see periods of time where we really were in a net positive situation. But then for one reason or another, those policies change or those programs go away and we slip backwards again. So it's something we have to be very vigilant about and to be thinking on a large scale because the problem is on a large scale. So yeah, Mark is right. I think the current trend is troubling, and the current administration in the U.S. is very non-wetland friendly. So we're likely to have some dark times here in the next little while, but all the more reason to roll up our sleeves and work harder to try to change that.
Thank you both. We do have a couple more questions. The next one is, can you address whether anyone is making wetlands with peat soils as a priority for carbon sequestration? This person has farmland with organic soil 4 feet or more in depth in Washington state.
Ooh. Maybe Mike can answer that one. That's out of my realm of knowledge.
Okay, I don't know exactly what's going on stateside there, but as Canada has tried to think about how it's going to meet its overall climate change commitments, avoiding loss of carbon stored in peatlands is a big part of what Canada is trying to do. We have a huge area of peatlands in Canada between the settled zone and the tundra, and a lot of that land is being designated now for protection, and it's really mostly to try to avoid the loss of the carbon that's there. I don't know what the situation is in the U.S. and whether there are programs in place there to do similar things, but it's certainly on the radar screen up here.
I know Gary Ivy is on the northwest, western part of the US. Gary, do you have any perspective?
Yes, my video doesn't work, but it's disabled for some reason. But I work on sandhill cranes, and I live in Oregon. But one of the big wetland areas is the old Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, where a lot of our cranes winter. And down in the Delta, that's all peat soils. It was a huge tule marsh historically that was reclaimed by diking and draining. But there's still quite a bit of peat, and there's efforts down there to actually rebuild the peat by growing emergent marsh like hardstem bulrush and cattails. And some of the farmers down there are now getting paid for carbon credits. People are buying it for mitigation for carbon credits, and they're trying to rebuild peat soils by growing a lot of wetland vegetation, which takes a long time. You know, they get like 1/10 of a centimeter a year, maybe. But anyway, over time, it's a good thing.
Margaret, we have a few more questions. Do you want to continue, or would you like to end now?
Why don't we take a couple more, and if people need to leave, they can, but I think if the more information we have out there for people, I think the more you'll value this webinar. So sure, let's take a couple more.
Sure. So the next question is from someone who's been reading books on beaver restoration, and they're wondering, how do beavers help reduce the cost of wetland restoration?
How they reduce the cost of wetland? Well, I mean, again, as kind of Mike maybe pointed out with their dams, they can actually kind of create wetlands on their own. And they're part of the natural ecosystem in some of these areas. So they're doing what they do naturally, and that's going to help, again, kind of that ecosystem just from the virtue of what those beavers are meant to do, so to speak. But again, they can also cause maybe some problems with some of that too, in terms of wetland restoration and kind of the inflows and so forth. But you know, they help with wetland restoration again because beavers kind of quote make wetlands. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you. And the next question is whether you have or Mike have any helpful hints to identify wetlands from satellite imagery. For example, areas that are wetlands but only seasonally so may be hard to identify depending on the timing when the imagery was captured.
A lot of times with that, it depends where they're, I'm not sure where they're from or what imagery they're looking at, but I know with a lot of the prairie potholes, a lot of the wetlands that I'm dealing with, the footprint of those wetlands, when I say footprint, it's kind of the boundary of those wetlands. When you see them from even, I don't care from how high the satellite is, they pop out. You know exactly where a wetland is. Because this, again, the soil's different, and that should show up on those satellite imagery. And again, without knowing where this individual's from or what they're wanting to look at, but without I wish I had a good shot of that, but you can pick them out pretty easily, at least the ones I'm familiar with.
The challenge, there's been a lot of work on that, a lot of investigation using different kinds of satellite imagery and so on. Aerial photography does a good job, but if you're talking about satellite imagery, radar does a good job of picking up wetness. Any water shows up pretty well. The Landsat work, which has been studied most extensively, the issue there is resolution, and they'll pick up wetlands very well, but they don't do very well at a size of less than a couple acres. So again, depending on the kind of wetland system you're talking about, they can be very effective, but they can also miss smaller wetlands, which you know, ecologically are still important things. they're just harder to resolve on a satellite image.
Yeah. And I think too, Mike, a lot of people, if they're doing that sort of work, at least here in the US, what they'll do is they'll also get a soils map and maybe take
Yeah,
satellite imagery and kind of mix those two together. And when you mix kind of these data sets together, it can get pretty accurate with kind of locating wetlands.
yeah.
Oh,
So if we knew more about exactly,
they
what
did-
system he's talking about, we could maybe provide a little
they've
more
just
information.
added in their system. This person is based out of eastern Idaho, mostly the Teton Valley.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, I guarantee you there's wetland soil maps or soil maps for that area. And if you could take that, and I'm sure that's digitized or in an electronic format, you take that layer of that information, overlay some satellite information, and you could start pulling that together. If you're just looking at, you have satellite imagery, again, my guess is you could kind of pick those wetlands out to a large extent just by looking at changes in the soil or vegetation, depending on what the imagery looks like. You would just have to look at it. There's no really good, I don't have a good formula for picking that out. And Gary has an idea.
Yeah, back in the 80s, the Fish and Wildlife Service did a national national wetlands inventory. So that should be online somewhere, give
Yeah.
you a pretty good idea where wetlands are, and those are maps. Hopefully they're digitized. I think they are.
Yeah.
And then Mark, our final question is really mostly targeted at the US. I'm not sure if there's some Canada aspect to it. Mike, it'd be great to include that too. But this is where you were talking about the ugly. The person is asking to clarify, if those who are denying climate change and is this affecting our ability to maintain wetlands, and will this denigrate our ability to address climate change vis-a-vis wetlands?
Yes. That's the short answer. Yes. And it's kind of a disconcerting thing that there's still resistance to understanding or recognizing that climate change is occurring. It just still kind of puzzles me to a large extent, and probably people don't want it to happen because it's again kind of an inconvenient truth, as the movie once said. But the longer we put that off, the sea level is not going to stop from rising. We're still going to lose coastal marshes. And actually here, I'm trying to think of the timeline. It's, we're going to start seeing some changes in Florida, into the Everglades, because that's a very low system. And a 1 foot change in sea level rise down there is going to make some huge differences. So things are not going to stop changing. And if we don't start paying attention to these, and kind of trying to do what we can to hopefully reverse it, we're going to see those changes happening to wetlands. And again, wetlands to me, I mean, we're losing coastal marsh. I mean, I don't know what other kind of canary you need. To me, it's a canary the size of an ostrich that this is going on. So I don't know what it takes, but other wetland systems in other places, and I'm thinking of the Arctic and northern Canada, that are going to be affected even more severely kind of initially here, and probably are being affected. So wetlands are a good indication of what's going on in terms of change, and the longer we push that off about doing something, the more it's going to hurt.
I'll only add that there is a lot of active research going on the dynamics of greenhouse gases and wetlands, and the opportunity to use conservation of wetlands as at least a partial offset for managing greenhouse gases, and I hope that will result in some some investment to try to mitigate some of those problems with wetlands and grasslands. At least the government in Canada is interested in doing that.
Thank you both. And Margaret, those are all of our questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary Ann. And thank you to Mark and Mike for doing this and for everybody for coming. And I just wanted to sum up something is, Mark did give some really good suggestions and recommendations. So the duck stamp is there. And as he mentioned, that money immediately goes for conservation, and the duck stamp equivalent that Canada has would be great. I would also recommend that, he had mentioned the Farm Bill in the US, that your radar goes up when you read about that. And I think it's also important to just say who you elect is really important, because as we know, wetlands is a big issue. It's a complicated issue, and it's going to take policy to make it happen. And your vote is what helps shape that policy. So with that, again, I want to thank you all for coming. And as you close out your browser, there is going to be a very short survey. And as I mentioned to you before, it's very important for us to get your thoughts about that. And I really appreciate you coming, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.